Knowing more jazz chords won't make you sound better, and yet most players are drowning in chords that they want to memorize but could never use in a song. So in this video I'm gonna show you the Joe Pass system and how he used it to turn simple 3-note chords into great sounding comping, chord melody and even chord solos. Here's the mistake most players make. They treat chords like a collection. They find a voicing they like, they memorize the shape, but their way of learning makes it almost impossible to connect chords when you're playing. Everything is isolated grip after isolated grip. Joe Pass did something completely different, and once you see it, you'll know how to get much more out of your chords. Think about the first time you learned a jazz chord. Maybe it was a C7 with a 13th and you memorized it as a single grip. Now, learning grips is fine for campfire chords, but in jazz, chords aren't static. They move, you're constantly shifting notes, adding little melodies, creating motion between the chords, and you can't do any of that if all you know is the grip. You need to understand what's actually inside the chord. Chords aren't locked to specific extensions either. One moment you might play the 13th and the next you might play something else. That's the freedom jazz gives you while playing chords. The chord is a starting point, not a fixed shape. The problem is that most players learn a voicing system, drop 2 voicings, Shell-voicings, diatonic inversions, and then stay inside it. The system becomes a prison. Joe Pass didn't think in systems. He thought in music, and that is exactly what we're going to look at in this video. Before I moved to the Netherlands, back when I was still living in Copenhagen and studying with Morten Kargaard, he gave me a Joe Pass solo transcription to learn. Now, I'd already worked through drop 2 and drop 3 voicings, so I was excited, but I was also trying to figure out how to build my own chord solos at the time. And that's when I noticed something. Joe wasn't playing static grips or sticking to one voicing system. In several places, he was taking a single chord and transforming it, shifting it into completely different types of voicings in order to make music. Now, in the second chorus of the blues solo, he plays this phrase on a B-flat-7 chord. And check out how many different shapes he actually gets out of just one single chord. If you break it down, he starts with this D diminished triad, moves to a 3-part quartal voicing, and then uses 2 drop 2 voicings. Now it's all B-flat-7, but the way he moves through it creates a melodic motion, a melody that really makes the whole thing happen. The logic is just actually different than thinking about the different chord voicings. A little bit later, he plays this. So he starts with sort of the Shell-voicing based D7 altered or D7 sharp 9, and then moves up to a drop 2 voicing, and then back to the Shell-voicing based one again. So really, of course, these are just 2 parts of the same voicing. He's just playing different string sets of it. And the same kind of happens up here. You have, and that's of course also just the same chord with different melodies on top. That's when it clicked. Joe Pass was doing 2 things. He was mixing voicing types and using variations of the same basic chord. Once I saw that, everything got a lot easier. So let's take a simple C major 7 and look at how you can do the same thing. One of the easiest connections to make is between Shell voicings and drop 3 voicings. Here's how this works. Now, if you take a simple Shell voicing like this, and then add a G on the B string, then it transforms into a drop 3 voicing. Just one note, but now you have 2 different shapes to move between, and that movement is what creates the melodic motion in your comping. Check out how that sounds in context. But here's the cool part, it doesn't stop at adding notes. You can also create connections by removing notes. And don't worry, you don't need to learn all of these phrases by heart of the video. If you want to go over the examples at your own pace, you can grab the free PDF of the examples. There's a link in the description. Removing notes doesn't just make the chord flexible and easier to play. It's actually one of the easiest ways to break out of fixed positions on the neck. Take this drop 3 voicing for C major 7. If you remove the root, the C, you're left with this. Now, still a rootless C major 7, of course, but it's also an E minor triad in second inversion. And because it is a triad, you have 3 inversions to work with. All the same notes, just in different positions. And you can of course add the root back in so you can hear that they actually work as C major 7 chords as well. Here's how that sounds in a comping context. This triad connection becomes especially powerful when you take it into chord soloing. Here's what it looks like on a B-flat blues using a B-flat 7 chord. So let's start with the D diminished triad, so that will be this one. You already saw that in the Joe Pass example. Now I can add the G on top as a melody note. Then we have sort of a rootless B-flat 7 with a 13. Now this leads naturally up to the next inversion of the D diminished triad. So that would be this one, the root position. And now we can sort of turn that into a complete melodic line. And notice how I'm also splitting the shell voicing in the beginning just to add a bit of extra movement. This way of opening up and connecting chords so that they become easier to make music with is also what I cover in my jazz chord craftsmanship course. If you want to learn to play melodies and improvise with chords while comping through standards, then join us in the jazz chord craftsmanship. There's a link in the video description. Let's get back to the vertical connection, because Joe Pass also linked this to drop 2 voicing. At its core, this is fretboard visualization, thinking of one chord but having several ways to play it. And this is where it starts to get really powerful. And you'll see exactly what I mean when we get to the Joe Pass lick in a moment. Check out how simple this is. You have the root position, or in fact you have root, then the root position shell voicing. And that becomes a drop 3 when you add that G on the B string. Now this can then be a triad because we take away the root. And if you add a note on the high E string, you get a drop 2 voicing. So from one chord, you now have sort of a whole connected system of shapes. And here's how that sounds as a C major 7 version of the Joe Pass lick from earlier. So the original was this. And if I play that now with the C major 7 voicing, you get this. Whether you're comping or playing a chord solo, that gives you a lot to work with in one position. But for this to work across the whole fretboard, you'll also need to be comfortable with the shell voicing with a root on the 5th string. And once you have that, the two systems connect in a way that gives you real freedom across the fretboard. And it also starts to sound like the real thing. Let's quickly look at the same system, starting from the other shell voicing, this time on G7, in the same area of the neck that we have the C major 7. So there's one small change here, but it actually shows you something interesting about how this system works. Here's the G7, and just like before, you can add a note to get a G7 with a 9. Now, I usually call these shell-derived voicings, though there's no real standard name for them. Again, here you can also remove the root, and then you get this. But unlike the C major 7, that doesn't give you sort of a clean triad. You could call this a major flat 5 triad, F major flat 5, but that description kind of breaks down if you move these through the scale. None of these works as traditional triads, but that doesn't really matter. The voicing still functions beautifully as a rootless G7 with a 9. And you can of course add notes on the high E string to turn it into a drop 2 as well. So the system still holds. It just looks a little bit different on this string set. Here's the full set of voicings for G7. Now let's put C major 7 and G7 together and hear what this system actually sounds like in a real progression. There's one thing Joe Pass does that ties everything in this video together, and this is it. Everything stems from the simple, basic version of the chord. You think the simple chord, and whatever you add is just a variation of it. In a basic 2-5-1, the chords you're thinking might look like this. But you don't have to play them as full shapes. Leave out the bass note, play the rootless version, and suddenly you have room to move with both melody and rhythm in any direction that you want. And this isn't just for chord solos. In a band setting where the bass player has the root covered, this approach is exactly how you comp, without getting in the way while still creating real movement. You have to turn those chord symbols into music, and here's what that sounds like. Remember that you can download the examples in the free PDF, so you don't need to memorize it all off the video. The link is in the description. And if you want to hear this system in action on a real song, I break down a full Autumn Leaves chord melody arrangement in this video. Chord melody is really where all of this starts to feel like real jazz. You've got the groove, the melody and the harmony. It's all there, and it's a lot of fun to play. Check it out. Learn jazz, make music.